They silenced Earth in the council, but humanity spoke through war. The moment they cut my microphone, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not humiliation, something quieter and far more dangerous. I had traveled 400 light years to speak for 8 billion people, and the Volkai elder sitting at the head of the Grand Accord had simply raised one long gray finger and pressed a button. A soft click, and then silence. My name is Yara Osai. I was Earth's first ambassador to the Galactic Accord, and on that day, standing in the center of a chamber so vast it had its own weather patterns near the ceiling, I learned something that no diplomatic school on Earth had ever taught me. Some rooms are not built for justice. They are built for the people who already have it. I had prepared for 3 years. 3 years of learning 7 alien languages well enough to argue in them. 3 years of studying the Accord's procedural codes, its precedents, its 5 centuries of political history. I knew which species leaned sympathetic to smaller civilizations. I knew which bloc the Keth Dominion had purchased with trade agreements that the Accord's public record described as mutual cooperation frameworks, which was the Accord's elegant way of saying that money had changed hands and loyalties had followed. I knew that the vote was going to be close, and I had prepared every single word of that speech to land in the exact cracks where minds could still be changed. I had gotten through 11 minutes of it. The chamber held 47 species. The seating arrangement alone had taken me 6 months to properly understand, because position in the chamber reflected political rank, and rank shifted every time a war ended or a treaty was signed or a civilization collapsed quietly into a lesser category and was moved outward toward the exits. That morning, Earth's designated position was in the lower tier, the outer ring, the seats closest to the large curved doors that led back into the transit corridors, the seats that sent a message before a single word was spoken. The Keth Dominion sat in the second ring from the center, comfortable, settled, the kind of comfortable that comes from knowing you have already decided how this ends. Their delegate, a creature named Voreth, had not looked at me once during my entire speech. Not once. He sat with his long body folded precisely in his chair and looked at the space slightly to the left of the podium where I was standing. The way you look at something you have already decided is not worth the attention of your eyes. I had been talking about the colonies, about Kepler 9 and its 12,000 residents who had woken up one morning to find Keth extraction ships parked above their homes, great dark industrial vessels that blocked the light and left the settlement in a shadow that the children thought, for the first 3 days, was simply a storm coming. About the water processing plants that had been dismantled piece by piece for raw materials, shipped off-world while the people who had built them watched and filed complaints through the Accord's official channel. Complaints that had been received and logged and placed in a queue for review at a date that was listed in the system as to be determined. About the families who had been relocated to holding zones, while Keth machinery tore up the soil of a world they had spent 20 years building into something worth living on. I had documents. I had testimony recordings from 46 separate colonists, recorded in their own voices in the holding zones, in the thin and tired voices of people who are trying to be clear and precise, because they know that clarity and precision are the only tools left to them. I had environmental reports. I had images that should have made anyone in that room reach some basic conclusion about what was happening and what it meant. And then the click. The Accord chair, Elder Suvan of the Volkai, did not look apologetic. He looked the way someone looks when they are performing a routine task they have performed many times before and see no particular reason to feel anything about. He spoke in galactic standard, which I understood perfectly, which meant I had the full experience of hearing every word. The silence protocol is invoked under Procedural Code 7, subsection 4. The petitioning species is classified as pre-deliberative. The floor is closed to further human testimony. Pre-deliberative. It was the Accord's very polished way of saying that Earth was not yet considered civilized enough to participate in decisions about its own fate. We had faster-than-light travel. We had faster-than-light communication. We had been members of the Accord's outer registry for 9 years. We had 140 million people living beyond Earth's home system, on colonies that humans had built with their hands and their minds, and the particular human refusal to accept that something cannot be done until it has been done. And we were pre-deliberative. I stood at the podium for 3 seconds without moving. I did not move because I was making a choice about what I would do with my face, my posture, my hands, and the particular quality of silence I was going to give that room in return for what it had just given me. The chamber noise rose around that silence, a wash of alien sound, clicking and humming, and the low tonal language of the Voakai that I could hear but not quite translate fast enough. Somewhere in the upper rings I caught a flash of movement from the delegate of the Shan Collective, a small and careful species from the far galactic arm who had always been kind to me in the corridors of the station and who I knew had been in genuine conflict about today's vote. She had her head turned away. She could not watch. I gathered my documents. I walked back to the lower tier. I sat down. The vote took 9 minutes. 39 in favor of granting the Keth Dominion full development rights over all contested colonial space within the designated border zone. 8 against. Earth was formally reclassified as a Tier 3 civilization with no defense guarantee and no right of appeal for 60 standard years. 60 years. The number was not an accident. 60 years was long enough by the Accord's calculations that any current political situation would have resolved itself through natural processes, which was also an elegant way of saying that if the Keth took everything they wanted while Earth had no right of appeal, the problem would eventually stop being a problem because the people making it would have run out of options. Voreth stood when the result was announced. He did not celebrate. He simply nodded slowly, the way a person nods when an outcome they planned for months finally arrives on schedule, and there is no longer any need for anything but the quiet satisfaction of a thing being finished. I watched him. I memorized his face, not out of anger, out of something colder and more useful than anger. My communicator vibrated once as I was walking through the corridor toward the transit bay. The message was encrypted with a military code that I was not officially supposed to have access to, from a general named Cord Harlow, who held the title of Commander of Earth's Joint Defense Command, a title that had meant something fairly modest for most of Earth's history, and now meant something considerably different. The encryption key was one that Cord and I had agreed on 18 months earlier, during a conversation we had never officially had. It contained 5 words. Ambassador, we have been patient. We are done. I stopped walking. A Voakai attendant nearly walked into me from behind. I stepped to the side of the corridor, stood with my back against the wall, and read those 5 words 3 more times. I had spent 3 years being patient. I had spent 3 years believing with the sincere and reasonable belief of someone who wants very much to be right that the right words, delivered in the right sequence to the right people, could accomplish what 8 billion human beings deserved without anyone having to pay for it in blood. I had believed in the Accord the way you believe in any system that has been running longer than you have been alive, because surely something that old and that vast must have learned something true about how beings who call themselves civilized ought to treat each other. It had not learned that thing, or it had learned it once and forgotten it, or it had decided, somewhere in its long and comfortable history, that the principle only applied to the beings who were already comfortable. Cord's message did not ask for my permission. It did not ask for my thoughts on the matter. It was not, in any meaningful sense, a question. It was a notification, sent to me after the fact, because they had waited for the vote to be final before telling me. And I understood perfectly well why. If I had known beforehand, I would have argued against it. They knew that. They had decided that my argument, however well-reasoned, was no longer the argument that mattered. I stood in that corridor for a long time. Behind me, the Grand Accord had already moved to its next item of business. Earth's case was a closed matter. 9 minutes of voting, preceded by 11 minutes of a speech they had not finished hearing. Done. I typed back one word. Understood. I put the communicator in my pocket. I straightened my jacket. I walked toward the shuttle bay. The galaxy had seen a species silenced. What it had not seen, and what it was about to discover in the most direct and unavoidable way possible, was that silence for humans has never been the end of the conversation. It is the moment just before something begins. It is the held breath. It is the last second of stillness before the door comes off its hinges and everything that was behind it comes through. We had been silent long enough. Cord Harlow had not slept in 31 hours when the confirmation came through. Not because he was unable to sleep, but because he had learned over 24 years of service that the hours before a decision of this particular size were not hours you were meant to spend unconscious. You were meant to feel every one of them pass. You were meant to understand what you were doing and why, not in the abstract language of strategy documents, but in the specific and personal language of a person who has thought about it, until the thinking becomes something that lives in your chest rather than your head. He was standing on the command bridge of the Terran fleet carrier TFS Unbroken, in stable orbit around a dwarf star called Helios Minor, 6 light-years from the nearest inhabited system, and just over 4 light-years from the nearest Accord monitoring station. The location had been chosen with the same precision that had characterized every element of the past decade's preparation. Nothing about the past 10 years had been accidental. Cord's full name was Cordell Harlow. He was 62 years old, born in Montana to a family of engineers, and he had the kind of face that suggested he had been outdoors in difficult weather for much of his life, which was accurate. He had started his career as a fighter pilot, moved into deep space logistics in his 30s, and then spent the last 12 years in a role that his official service record described as research coordination and development oversight, which was the most accurate possible description of his actual work, in the sense that it was technically not false while communicating nothing that was true. His daughter, who was named Holly and worked as a marine biologist at a research station on New Zealand's South Island, had stopped asking what research coordination meant somewhere around year 3. She had told him once, during one of their monthly calls, that she had simply decided he was doing something important, and she would find out what it was when everyone else did. Cord had told her she was probably right about that. She had laughed and changed the subject to the albatross population she was studying, which was recovering well, and which made Cord feel something warm in a part of himself he kept mostly quiet. He thought about Holly sometimes when things were very serious. It was not a distraction. It was a reminder of what seriousness was for. The bridge of the Unbroken was quiet in the specific way that only military spaces can be quiet, full of people doing precise and demanding work with complete concentration, conserving every unit of noise for the things that required it. 18 officers at their stations. Holographic displays showing the real-time positions of 312 ships arranged in a formation that spanned 2.4 million kilometers of open space. Looking at that formation on the tactical screen, Cord felt something he had felt only a few times in his career. Not excitement, not pride. The particular calm that settles over you when years of preparation finally arrive at their destination, and you realize that you are, in fact, ready. The Unbroken was not the ship that Accord inspection teams had seen. The Accord had conducted 2 formal inspections of Earth's registered military fleet in the past 6 years, and both times they had seen what they were meant to see. Capable vessels, solid construction, propulsion and weapons systems appropriate for a Tier 3 civilization with a modest but growing presence in space. The inspectors had taken their measurements, filed their reports, and recommended that Earth be maintained at its current tier classification, with the notation that its military development appeared consistent with expected parameters. Not one of those inspected ships was anywhere near Helios Minor. The fleet that surrounded the Unbroken had never been seen by a single Accord inspector, and its existence had not been detected by any Accord monitoring system. It had been constructed across 8 separate facilities, all of them hidden inside asteroid clusters and deep space platforms that had been built without appearing in any of Earth's official infrastructure declarations. The materials had moved through 47 layers of commercial intermediaries. The engineers who designed and built the ships had signed documentation of the most binding kind, and they understood fully what they were working toward and why. Earth had been building this fleet for 10 years. It had begun as a contingency plan, the kind of thing that careful governments maintain because a world that has been through the history Earth had been through learns to plan for the scenario where talking is no longer sufficient. Then the contingency plan became the primary plan. And then it became the only plan, because the Accord had made its intentions clear through years of gradual movement in a single direction. And that direction was not one that left room for doubt about where it was heading. The Cascade Drive was the fleet's most significant advantage, and Cord thought about it often with a mixture of scientific admiration and practical satisfaction. It had taken 11 years to develop, and it had started with a collection of broken pieces that anyone else in the galaxy would have looked at and seen as wreckage. During a salvage operation 9 years into Earth's space exploration program, human engineers had recovered debris from 3 separate shipwrecks drifting in an unstable region of deep space. A Volocai heavy freighter whose drive core had catastrophically failed, leaving the vessel cold and dark with the drive housing split open. A Keth patrol vessel that had been picked largely clean by scavengers but still had its drive architecture partially intact. And a ship from a species that the Accord's registry listed only as unaffiliated, which in Accord language meant a civilization that had reached space and then was no longer present in it. This third ship was old in a way that was difficult to quantify precisely, and the technology inside it operated on principles that the first human engineers to examine it spent 3 months arguing about before agreeing they needed more engineers. All 3 ships used completely different faster-than-light systems. The Volocai used folded dimensional compression, bending the geometry of space itself around the vessel in a way that shortened the distance between 2 points without the ship technically moving through the intervening space. The Keth used gravitational inversion, a system that manipulated local gravity fields to generate a controlled fall toward the destination, which was fast but required extraordinarily precise calibration, or the vessel would miss its endpoint by distances that were not survivable. The unaffiliated ship used a system that the human team eventually labeled resonance displacement, a term they chose because it was the most honest description of what they observed, and because they genuinely did not have the theoretical framework to say more than that yet. Most species presented with 3 incompatible and mutually contradictory faster-than-light systems would have studied each one separately, determined which was most efficient and most reliably reproducible, and built from there. This was the rational approach. It was systematic. It was what the Accord's own engineering doctrine recommended. The human team had looked at all 3 systems and asked a different question. What happens if you run all of them simultaneously? The answer reached after 8 years, 14 failed prototypes, 2 containment failures that were never reported to any external authority, and a theoretical breakthrough achieved at 3 in the morning by an engineer who had been on her 16th consecutive hour of work, was the Cascade Drive. It was faster than any single system by a margin that Cord's engineering team described in their internal reports as embarrassingly large, which was not a technical term, but was accurate. It also produced a secondary effect that had not appeared in any theoretical model. When a cascade drive engaged at close range to vessels using conventional faster-than-light systems, the interference pattern it created in local space disrupted the navigation locks of those conventional systems for a period ranging from 30 seconds to 4 minutes, depending on drive type. In practical terms, every ship in Chord's hidden fleet could outrun anything the Keth had, and could do so while making Keth ships temporarily lose their ability to hold a course. The Keth did not know this. The Accord did not know this. The only people in the galaxy who knew this were approximately 400 humans who had signed documentation of the most binding kind possible, and who understood, in the very specific way of people who have worked toward something for a decade, what was at stake if the information left the room early. Lieutenant Petra Gaines was at the communication station behind Chord. She was 28 years old, from a city in northern England called Durham, calm under pressure in the way that some officers simply are, as though their nervous systems had made a permanent decision about it. She had been on the Unbroken for 2 years, and she was among the best Chord had ever worked with. "The confirmation from Ambassador Osai has arrived," she said. "One word, understood." Chord looked at the tactical display for a moment. 312 ships, 10 years, 12,000 people in holding zones on a world they had built themselves. He opened the fleet-wide channel. "This is Admiral Harlow," he said. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. "We are going to Kepler 9. We are going to bring those 12,000 people home, and then we are going to make very sure that nothing like this is ever done to our people again." He paused for 1 second, enough waiting. "We fight with everything. Leave nothing on the table." He closed the channel. "Cascade drives," he said to Petra, "all 312. Execute." The stars shifted. 312 ships built in secret over 10 years, crewed by people who had trained for exactly this moment, armed with technology that the galaxy had never seen, moved through space at a speed that should not have been possible for a pre-deliberative species. Behind them, an Accord monitoring station 4 light-years away recorded a brief and inexplicable disturbance in local space-time, and then went quiet. No alarm was raised. By the time anyone in the Accord understood what had moved through that space, an alarm would not have mattered. Dara Cole had been awake for 19 consecutive hours when the shuttle doors opened, and the heat of Kepler 9 met her like something solid. Not the clean warmth she remembered from the Cornish coast where she had grown up, but something heavier and thicker, the air of a world that had been altered, that had had things taken out of it that were not meant to be removed. She was 26 years old, and she had been a sergeant in the 7th Terran Shock Division for 3 years. Before that, she had studied engineering at university for 2 years, before walking into a recruitment office the morning after Kepler 9 first appeared on the news feeds. She remembered exactly what she had been doing when she saw the footage. She had been eating breakfast, and the images had come through on the screen in her kitchen. Families being walked out of homes at dawn, children being carried, a woman who kept looking back over her shoulder at the house behind her. Dara had watched for 40 seconds. Then she had turned off the screen, packed a bag, and gone to the recruitment office. The officer at the desk had asked why she wanted to serve. She had told him the truth, because someone has to go get them back. He had looked at her for a moment and pushed the paperwork across the desk. 3 years later, Sergeant Dara Cole stood on a landing platform 10 kilometers from the main settlement of Kepler 9, listening to the sounds of a world in the process of being contested. Lieutenant Owen Barry was beside her, checking his tactical screen. Owen was from Liverpool, tall and steady-voiced, the kind of officer whose presence makes the people around him feel like things are probably going to hold together. She had served with him for 18 months and trusted him completely. "Fleet took out 2 extraction platforms on approach," Owen said. "Third went dark 20 minutes before we landed. They hit it clean. We have orbital control." He scrolled through the feed. Ground situation is more complicated. Tell me. Keth Garrison, full estimate 1,800 to 2,000. 3 defensive perimeters. 1 around the settlement center, 2 on the main access roads. Northern approach has the heaviest concentration, shielded vehicles and static emplacements. He looked up from the screen. They knew we were coming. They have had weeks to prepare. They knew we would come from the north, Dara said. That is where our orbital support grid can do the most work, Owen agreed. So that is where they put the armor. Dara pulled up her own tactical display and looked at the settlement map. It was a colonial map, made by colonists for colonists, showing the layout of a place that had been built organically over 20 years. Not a military document. She looked at the edges of the settlement, the places that a garrison focused on military defense might not have prioritized because they were built for daily life rather than conflict. There, she said. She pointed to the eastern edge of the map, where the survey records showed a water reclamation facility constructed in the settlement's first year. What is the layout under that facility? Owen checked his records. After a moment, his expression shifted in the way that meant he had found something useful. Conduit tunnel system. Colonial standard engineering. Runs from the reclamation facility to the central district. 1.6 kilometers. Underground. Underground. Dara looked at the tunnel route on the map. She looked at the northern approach where the Keth had positioned their heavy assets. She looked at the central district where the command post would logically be. She thought about how a garrison expecting an attack from the north would have oriented its attention, and how much of that attention would be facing the wrong direction if something arrived from beneath the eastern edge of the settlement. We are going through the pipes, she said. Owen nodded as if she had said something reasonable, which she had. I will get the unit ready. 41 soldiers. She split them into 3 groups. The first group, 12 people under Corporal Nadia Sims, would move toward the northern approach with enough visibility and noise to hold the garrison's attention on the threat it had prepared for. Not attacking, just moving and being seen, because a garrison watching 12 soldiers come from the north is not watching what is happening under its feet. The second group, 9 soldiers with the unit's heavier support systems, would take position on the elevated ridge to the west and wait. The third group was Dara and 20 soldiers and the tunnel. She briefed everyone in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Good soldiers do not need long briefings. They need clear information about where they are going, what they need to accomplish, and a reason they can hold on to when things become difficult. Dara was best at the third. Those holding zones have had 12,000 people in them for 6 months, she told them, and she said it the way you say something true. 6 months. Some of those people have been there so long they have started to think of the zones as normal. We are going to remind them what normal actually is. She looked at each of them quickly. 30 minutes, maybe 40. Move right, and that is all this needs to be. And if we do not move right, someone asked. She did not look to see who. Then we keep moving anyway, she said. Questions? No questions. They moved at first light. The water reclamation facility had been abandoned for 3 months. The Keth had no operational interest in maintaining civilian infrastructure they had not built. Dara went in first, dropped through the access hatch, and felt the cool mineral smell of the tunnel close around her. The pipe was narrow, low enough that she had to angle her shoulders. Water moved along the bottom, cold and ankle-deep. She did not think about the distance underground or the weight of the world above her. She thought about the distance to the central district and the approach angle, and where the command post would be positioned. 20 soldiers followed her in single file. No lights except the small directional lamps on their tactical gear, aimed down, kept close to the floor. 38 minutes through the tunnel. Steady movement. Controlled. Dara counted her steps the way she had taught herself to do in confined spaces, not to track distance, but to give her mind something to do with itself that was not the darkness and the weight above. At the far end, she stopped at the base of the ladder, She listened. Above her, she could hear Keth communications equipment running. She could hear movement, controlled and regular, soldiers at their posts facing north, watching the direction where the attack was supposed to come from. The particular cadence of a garrison that is alert but confident in its positioning. She went up. What followed was not clean or quiet or free of cost. Close fighting in tight urban space never is. Every turn in every narrow street between colonial buildings is a decision made in less than a second, and every decision has a consequence that plays out in the seconds immediately following it. And the only thing that keeps you functional through all of those consecutive decisions is that your training has made the right choices feel like breathing, automatic, built into the body, rather than requiring the mind to locate them fresh each time. Dara's group moved through the settlement from east to center in a pattern that the Keth garrison, oriented toward the north, was not able to track until it was inside their perimeter. When the command post's communications went down, cut by a precise and practiced action from one of Dara's engineers, the garrison's three perimeters lost the ability to coordinate. Nadia's group pushed from the north into the opening. The Western Ridge group descended into the settlement. The Keth garrison, trained for direct confrontation with an opponent it could orient against, encountered the specific and disorienting situation of being engaged from directions it had not prepared for, and it responded the way formations respond when they lose their coherence and their ability to talk to each other simultaneously. 19 hours after the first shuttle touched down at Forward Operating Base Echo, Dara Cole stood in the main square of Kepler-9's settlement. The gates of the holding zones opened at 10 minutes past dawn. She watched the first families come through. She watched the moment when people who had been inside a fence for 6 months stepped outside it and looked at the open sky and understood that the sky was theirs again. A girl who was maybe 4 years old came out holding her mother's hand. She stopped in the open square and looked up, all the way up, at the sky above the settlement. She said something to her mother that Dara could not hear from where she was standing. The mother crouched down, said something back, and then picked the girl up and held her very tightly, the way you hold something you have been afraid of losing. Dara looked away. She sent her report to Cord Harlow. Kepler-9 is clear, 12,000 accounted for, settlement secured. Back in the Grand Accord chamber, a live transmission feed from Kepler-9 had been playing on the floor displays for 40 minutes. Several delegates had requested it be turned off. Elder Suvan had been unable to locate a procedural code that permitted him to do so. He watched a human sergeant in dusty armor walk through a square full of families finding each other. "What are they?" he said very quietly to the aide standing beside him. The aide did not have an answer. In the chamber around them, 47 species sat with the question and found that they did not have answers either. Yara had not expected the summons to arrive so quickly. It had been exactly 6 weeks and 2 days since she had walked out of the Grand Accord chamber with a switched-off microphone and 5 words in her pocket. She had spent those 6 weeks at Earth's embassy on Station 7, filing diplomatic reports and watching the news feeds with the attention of someone who understands they are watching history move in real time, but cannot yet tell which shape it is settling into. The news feeds were extraordinary. The Keth Dominion, which had expanded continuously for 3 centuries and had never lost a military engagement against a species it had chosen to target, was losing, not grinding slowly toward a disadvantageous position. Losing, clearly and empirically, and in ways that the Accord's own analysts were publishing careful papers about. Papers full of language like anomalous tactical outcomes and drive system interference patterns of unknown origin and engagement dynamics, inconsistent with projected capability differentials. Papers that were, in their very measured academic language, trying to explain why the species that had been classified as pre-deliberative 6 weeks ago was dismantling a 3-century military institution with apparent methodical efficiency. 42% of the Keth's active fleet neutralized in 3 weeks. 8 colonial extraction operations shut down, including 2 that the Accord had not officially known were operating. Kepler-9 liberated in under 24 hours. 2 other worlds under Keth occupation, neither of them inhabited by humans, had sent unofficial communications to Earth's command asking whether Terran forces might be available. Cord had responded to both with the same answer: "Hold. We know you are there. We have not forgotten." The summons arrived on a Wednesday. It came through the Accord's official diplomatic channel, marked with Elder Suvan's personal seal, which meant it originated from Suvan himself and not through any procedural office or aide. It requested her presence at an emergency session of the full Grand Accord in 48 hours. It used the word requested. 6 weeks ago, the communication summoning her to the original session had used the word required. Yara read both words 3 times each and understood exactly what the distance between them represented. She calmed Cord Harlow. When his face appeared on the screen, he looked tired in the deep and bone-level way of someone who had been operating at full intensity for 6 weeks and had not stopped because the work had not stopped. But his eyes were clear and focused. "I have the summons," she said. "I know. My team flagged it within the hour. They used the word requested." "I noticed. What do you want me to say?" Cord thought about this for a moment. When Cord thought visibly, it was because the question was worth the pause. "Say what you went to say 6 weeks ago," he said. "All of it this time, without apologizing for any of it and without offering anything they have not earned." He paused. "The terms are the terms. Do not negotiate below them." "The terms are significant," Yara said. "So is 6 months in a holding zone," Cord replied. Yara nodded. "There is something else I want to do." Cord looked at her. "The silence protocol," she said. "I am going to use it." There was a brief pause on the line. Then Cord made a sound she had learned over 2 years of working closely with him, meant that he had thought of something and found it exactly right. "All right," he said. "Make sure you have the procedural text memorized." "I memorized it 6 weeks ago when they used it on me," she said. Cord almost smiled. It was a near thing, but she caught it. "Good," he said. "Go to the session, Yara, and take the map." "I was already planning to take the map." "I know, I just wanted to say it." She arrived at the Grand Accord chamber 2 hours before the session was scheduled. The corridors of the station were quieter than she had ever seen them. She passed small groups of delegates who stopped their conversations when they noticed her and resumed them after she passed. She passed 2 members of the Shan collective delegation, and one of them stepped forward. "Ambassador Osai," the delegate said, "I want you to know that the Shan collective's vote was not unanimous. Not everyone in my delegation agreed with what happened." Yara looked at her. "I know," she said. "I know exactly how every member of every delegation voted. I have kept detailed records." She paused. "So has Earth." The delegate held her gaze. She seemed to understand that this was a true statement about how carefully Earth had been paying attention, and not the kind of statement that required a particular response other than acknowledgement. "Yes," the delegate said. "I thought you might have." The chamber filled slowly. Several species that typically arrived well in advance were late. The Keth delegation arrived last, and Vorath took his seat without looking at the lower tier. The upper rings filled with the quiet tension of people who know something significant is about to happen and are not certain which direction it is going to land. Elder Suvan called the session to order. His voice had the same measured quality it always had. But Yara heard something underneath it that had not been there 6 weeks ago. An awareness that the room he was presiding over had changed in character from the room he was accustomed to presiding over. "The Grand Accord convenes an emergency session under Article 9 of the Founding Charter," he said. "The matter before us is the ongoing military engagement between the Terran Union and the Keth Dominion, and its implications for the stability of Accord member space. The Accord recognizes the Terran ambassador. Ambassador Os, you have the floor. Yara stood. She walked to the speaking platform. She looked around the chamber, all the way around, making brief and deliberate contact with whoever could meet eyes in their biology. She arranged nothing on the surface of the platform. She had not brought documents this time. 6 weeks ago she began, and her voice was completely level. I stood in this chamber and I attempted to present evidence of what was being done to Earth's colonial residents. I was stopped under Procedural Code 7, subsection 4 before I could complete that testimony. The Accord then voted, without hearing our position, to grant the Keth Dominion rights over the space where 12,000 of our people were living. She paused. I want to say something clearly before I continue. The Accord's procedures were followed correctly. What happened to Earth in this chamber 6 weeks ago was technically lawful under your rules. I want the record to show that I understand this. She let that rest for 2 seconds. It was also the most consequential error in judgment this body has made in the past 100 years, and I believe that most of the people in this room already know that. No one interrupted. Earth is not here today to request a ceasefire, she said. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to present terms. The distinction is important, and I am confident everyone in this room is clear on what it means. She presented the terms. She read each one clearly, at a pace that allowed every translation system in the chamber to keep up, and she paused between items long enough for the weight of each to settle before the next one arrived. Full sovereignty, unconditional, over all 14 human colonial worlds. Full reparations from the Keth Dominion, calculated at rates determined by Earth's own accounting, payable over a timeline determined by Earth's own preference. Immediate reclassification of Earth to Tier 1 membership with all associated rights and guarantees. A permanent seat on the Inner Council with full voting rights and full speaking rights, dated retroactively to Earth's original application 9 years earlier, which meant 9 years of backdated participation in decisions that Earth had been excluded from. Formal amendment to Procedural Code 7, subsection 4, abolishing the silence protocol's application to any species with verified faster-than-light capability and 3 or more years of Accord registry membership. And a formal statement, entered permanently into the Accord's official record, acknowledging that the vote of 6 weeks prior was in error and had caused demonstrable harm to Earth's civilian population. She finished reading. She had brought nothing to the platform and she set nothing down. These are not requests, she said. They are the conditions under which Earth will end its current military operations. We are prepared to discuss implementation timelines. We are not prepared to discuss whether any individual term is acceptable. They are all acceptable. That is why they are the terms. Vorath stood. His translator created its familiar half-second delay. The Keth Dominion wishes to express that the current conflict arose from a misunderstanding of mutual. Yara raised one hand and pressed the control on the speaking platform. A soft click. Vorath's audio feed cut off. The chamber did not erupt in shouting. It erupted in the simultaneous sound of 47 species, reacting to the same moment at the same instant. A wave of alien noise that moved through the space and rebounded off the curved walls and settled into a silence that was more complete than any silence Yara had heard in the chamber before. She waited for the silence to fully arrive. Procedural Code 7, subsection 4, she said. I have invoked the silence protocol against the Keth delegate. The Keth Dominion's classification in Earth's own registry, the registry we established 3 weeks ago for species that have conducted unprovoked seizure of colonial territory, is pre-deliberative. She looked at Suvan directly. I trust the protocol is being applied consistently across all parties. Suvan looked at her for a long time. There is no such registry, he said finally. There is now, Yara said. Earth established it 22 days ago. It is not an Accord document. It is an Earth document. We are entitled to maintain our own records as all Accord members are. A brief pause. The Keth delegate may be seated. Vorith sat down. Yara stepped back from the platform and activated the transmitter she was carrying. In the center of the Grand Accord chamber, projected in high-resolution holographic format, a three-dimensional tactical map appeared. It showed the current positions of 312 Terran vessels in real time, their locations in space, their current headings, the precise distance from the lead formation to the Keth home system. It was not accompanied by any statement. It was not framed as a threat. It was simply information, accurate and current and completely clear. The silence that followed was the most complete silence Yara had experienced in 11 years of diplomatic work. She had been in rooms where people were afraid before. She had never been in a room where the fear was this large and this unanimous and this absolutely impossible to politely set aside. Elder Suvan looked at the holographic map for a very long time. Then he looked at Yara. "The Accord," he said, and his voice had something in it that Yara did not think was manufactured, "will take the terms under advisement." "The Accord has 48 hours," Yara said. "After that, the fleet's operational schedule resumes." She turned and walked back to the lower tier. "Earth will be in the outer ring if you need to reach us." She sat down. She did not look at anyone. She looked at the holographic map still rotating in the center of the room, the 312 ships built in secret over 10 years by people who had believed this moment was coming and had worked toward it every single day. 31 hours later, the Accord accepted every term. Not 48, 31, which told Yara everything she needed to know about how seriously they were taking the map. 1 year after the emergency session, Yara Os stood at the window of the Terran wing of the Grand Accord station, with a cup of tea that was cooling faster than she was drinking it. The Terran wing had been formally established 8 months ago, after a negotiation over the station's floor plan that had required considerably less discussion than Yara had expected. Because the Accord's administrative office had discovered that being accommodating to Earth's requests was a priority they were currently internally motivated to honor. The docking traffic outside her window moved in the steady patterns of a functioning galactic hub. Freighters and diplomatic vessels and supply ships from dozens of species, moving in and out of the station in lanes that were now labeled on the official station map in Galactic Standard and in English. The English labels had been Yara's specific request. They had been approved within 48 hours. She thought about how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The Accord was still the Accord. 47 species still held seats in the chamber. Elder Suvan was still the chair, though he had aged visibly in the past year in the way of someone who has spent 12 months thinking about something he cannot stop thinking about. The procedural codes were still largely intact. The universe still operated by most of the same rules it had always operated by. And yet, Earth held a Tier 1 seat on the Inner Council. Yara held it personally. She sat in the second ring now, not the outer tier, not the seats near the exit. She sat where you sat when the room had decided you belonged there, and the room had made that decision with 47 votes in favor and 0 against, because the original terms had included no provision for abstention. The silence protocol had been amended. The formal language occupied 4 paragraphs in the Accord's revised procedural code, but its effect was simple. No species with verified faster-than-light capability and 3 or more years of registry membership could be silenced mid-petition for any reason. The amendment had a name in the Accord's informal internal records. The Accord's administrative staff, who saw everything and remembered everything and were, Yara had discovered, people with a dry and precise sense of humor, called it the human clause. She had not asked for that name. She had heard about it from an aide who mentioned it with careful neutrality. Yara had thought about it for a moment and then said she appreciated the clarity of the label. The aide had seemed satisfied with this. The Keth Dominion was no longer, in any meaningful operational sense, the entity it had been. The military structure had been substantially dismantled. The occupied worlds were in various stages of recovery. The reparations were moving through the mechanisms that large financial transfers move through, slowly and procedurally, as these things always move, but moving. Kepler 9's colonial residents had gone home. The holding zone structures had been torn down, and the water processing plants were being rebuilt with materials purchased with Keth reparations funds, according to specifications that the colonial residents themselves had submitted, because Yara had insisted that the people who built the settlement the first time should be the ones who decided how it was rebuilt. Cord Harlow had retired from active command 3 months after the Accord session. He had gone home to New Zealand, to his daughter Holly's house near the research station where she studied seabirds, and he had spent the first 2 weeks, by his own account, doing nothing at all, sitting on the porch, looking at the ocean, letting the sound of the water do whatever it does to a person who has been working at that intensity for 12 years and is finally in a place where nothing requires his immediate attention. Yara had called him during that period. "How is the ocean?" she asked. "The same as always," he said. "That is the thing I like about it." She asked if he was all right. "I am fine," he said. "I am going to stay fine for a while, I think. Holly has got a project tracking albatross migration patterns that she wants my help with. I have no useful skills for it. It will be very good for me." Yara had laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her because she had not laughed like that in what felt like a long time. Cord had sounded pleased in his characteristically understated way. She thought about him now, standing at the window, and she felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite affection, but contained both of them. Cord had built the fleet and she had used it. That was true. But what she thought about more often was the specific quality of patience he had carried for 10 years, the patience of someone who has decided on an outcome and is willing to take the long way to it without ever losing sight of where the long way leads. She thought about Dara Cole every day. That was simply true, and she did not try to make it less true. Dara had died in the final campaign, during a clearing operation on the last Keth-held world, 17 days before the Accord's acceptance of the terms. Cord had told Yara about it in a message that was brief because he knew, correctly, that brevity was what that kind of information required. She had sat with the message for a long time before she responded. She kept Dara's mission report in the top drawer of her desk. She had read it many times. She had written a long letter to Dara's family, to her parents in Cornwall and to her younger brother Will, who was 17, and who Yara had learned, through the correspondence that followed, was the kind of person who asked the same kinds of questions that Dara had asked. Will had written to her 3 times. In the 3rd letter he said he was thinking about joining the service when he was old enough. Yara had written back and told him to study everything first. History and languages and engineering and whatever else interested him, and whatever else did not but seemed important. Will had replied with 1 sentence, "She always said the same thing about you." Yara had put that letter in the same drawer as the mission report. She thought about the 8 species that had voted against the original grant. She had written to each of their delegations within the first 2 weeks, and not official diplomatic correspondence. Personal messages, written in each species' first language to whatever degree Yara had been able to learn it, which in 3 cases was enough for the entire message, and in the other 5 cases was enough for the opening and the close with a note explaining that she was still learning and intended to continue. She thanked each of them for their vote. She said that Earth remembered clearly who had stood on which side, and that remembering was not the same as keeping score, but it was also not the same as forgetting. 3 had responded almost immediately. 2 more had responded in the following month. 1 delegation had sent a representative to the Terran wing in person without advance notice, which Yara had taken as the most direct form of diplomatic communication available, and she had cleared her entire afternoon for the conversation that followed. It lasted 4 hours and covered topics from colonial law to the history of the Silence Protocol, to the particular challenges of species that are small in a political system built by and for species that are not. The remaining two were being given time. Some peoples moved slowly. Yara had decided to be the kind of diplomat who understood the difference between slowness and unwillingness and treated them accordingly. 3 weeks ago, she had received a message through an encrypted channel she maintained for off-record contact. It was from a representative of the Talon Confederation, a civilization on the far side of Accord space that had been in a position not entirely unlike Earth's for the past 15 years, and who had been watching the past year unfold with what the message described as considerable and evolving interest. They were asking, carefully, and through a channel that left no official record, whether Earth might be willing to talk. 2 weeks ago, a message from the Veth Assembly, a species that had been denied tier reclassification 5 times in 6 years on grounds that the Accord's own internal notes described as procedural, but which, on examination, had been applied to the Veth and not applied to other species in comparable situations. They were not asking for intervention. They were asking whether Earth would be willing to sit as an observer in their next reclassification hearing. 1 week ago, a third message, from a people called the Oran, who had no single homeworld, and existed in a distributed network of habitats across several systems, and who the Accord classified under a separate and less favorable category called non-standard civilization, which came with restrictions on representation and treaty rights that the Oran had been challenging unsuccessfully for 30 years. They were asking a different question from the others. Not can you help, not will you observe. They were asking how. How did you do it, they wanted to know. How did you make them listen? Yara had drafted 3 separate responses and found that none of them said what she actually meant. She had thought about it for a week, turning the question over the way you turn something over when you know the answer is there, and you are waiting for the right words to arrive for it. And then she had written something simple. We got angry enough to be worth listening to, and then we never stopped talking. The second part is harder than the first. It requires that you stay at the table even after the table has been used against you. It requires that you believe the table is worth staying at, not because you trust the people currently sitting there, but because the alternative is to have no seat at all and no voice in what happens next. The second part is the only part that matters in the end. The anger gets you through the door. The talking is what you do once you are inside. She had sent all 3 the same message. 2 had written back within 48 hours. Yara finished the last of her tea. It was cold by then, but she finished it anyway. She set the cup on the window ledge and kept her hand around it for a moment, feeling the residual warmth through the ceramic. Outside the window, the Grand Accord Station moved through its ordinary operations. The largest and oldest diplomatic institution in this part of the galaxy, conducting its daily business, processing its 10,000 pieces of correspondence, and its 40 active protocols, and its continuously updating registry of member species and tier classifications, the whole vast machinery of galactic civilization managing itself. And in the Terran wing, which had not existed 1 year ago, a human woman stood at a window and thought about 8 billion people on a pale blue planet a long way away. She thought about 12,000 people on a colonial world who were home now. She thought about a girl who had moved through a tunnel under a hostile world to open a gate, and about a man who had sat on a porch looking at the ocean and deserved every minute of it. She thought about 3 messages in her encrypted queue from peoples who had decided, after watching this past year, that Earth was the kind of entity worth reaching out to. Showing up was what the response required. That was all. Showing up and staying at the table and talking and listening and learning the languages and writing the personal letters and remembering every name on every list and never treating the size of the task as a reason to stop moving toward it. Earth had a seat at the table. It had taken 10 years of quiet preparation and 6 weeks of open conflict and 1 year of difficult and careful work to earn it. Keeping the seat would take the rest of Yara's career and the careers of everyone who came after her. That was not a problem. It was simply the nature of the work. And the nature of humans, which was a thing the galaxy was still in the process of learning, was that they did not stop. She looked out at the stars, the same stars that were visible from Cornwall and from New Zealand and from Kepler 9 on a clear night with no extraction ships blocking the sky. The same stars that had always been there, waiting for the species that would eventually come out to meet them. The galaxy had learned to spell the word human in the past year, not as a category, not as a tier classification, not as a designation in a registry, as something else, as a description of a kind of presence, a certain quality of persistence, a particular way of moving through difficulty that the galaxy had not encountered before and was still in the process of understanding. Yara thought it was probably going to take them a while to fully understand it. She was all right with that. She had time, and she intended to use every bit of it. She picked up the empty cup and went to make another. There was a great deal of work left to do, and she was looking forward to doing it.